We're at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis for a Filmmakers Dialogue with Olivier Assayas. Olivier's new film, Carlos, was the central event of this year's Cannes Film Festival, and since then it's garnered attention all over the world. But it's really the latest high point in one of the most inspiring careers in modern cinema. Olivier has always been fearless as a filmmaker. He's always been restlessly attentive to the changing energies of the world around him. And he has always wanted to make films that caught those changing energies. He's given us an expanded consciousness of cinema and of the world as we know it. And that's why I prize his films. I'm Kent Jones. I'm a writer and a filmmaker. I'm also the executive director of the World Cinema Foundation. I'm very happy to be back here at the Walker Arts Center for a Regis Dialogue with Olivier Assayas.
Thank you. I want to start off by acquainting the audience a little bit with your life before cinema, meaning before you started making movies, you wrote about them, and people who know for Cahiers du Cinéma, and people who people often assume that you had the childhood, going to the movies every week at the Cinémathèque Française, skipping school to go see the new, Godard film or the old Vincent Minnelli film, and you have always made the point that your relationship to cinema was very, very different from that, and I just wanted to start there.
Well, it's a long story. I grew up in a family that's had a movie connection. My father was a screenwriter, and there were filmmakers around, but not so much modern filmmakers from the Nouvelle Vague. I mean, they were more like directors from another generation, and they felt, to me as a kid, very nice old man, and and certainly not somehow connected to whatever I would have wanted to do in the future in my life, and specifically in terms of my art. So I grew up in the 70s. What was the most attractive for a teen at that time was, I suppose, the political radicality, the music, the various shapes and forms of rock and roll of those days. I mean, it was like the music from the counterculture, literature, poetry, and eventually movies. But I don't know, when the filmmakers from the French Nouvelle Vague were in their formative years, their fascination for movies was the center of the world. It was just like really, the culture was turning around those movies and the relationship to movies, and how it was a new art form being born in many ways. Modern cinema, in terms of its approach, is very different from whatever classic cinema was. So there was a sense in those days of reinventing an art form. When I was growing up, it was part of the culture, but again, it was not so much the classic cinephile culture. What I was attracted to were the experimental films, were the radical films, were the modern American films, and which to me connected with the art that was what felt, the zeitgeist of my times. So it's for some reason I always knew that I would make movies someday. I had this kind of I don't even dare use the word vocation because it's somehow even weak in terms of the certitude I have as a small child that I would be one day making movies and but somehow what nourished me again, during those extremely important years when you are discovering the world and trying to understand and make sense of your relationship with it, it was not movies. It was because in the 70s, again, that's the movies were not at the center of the culture. So whenever I started making films, those films were inspired by things outside of the film world, and of course it sounds pretty obvious in the sense that when you make movies, hopefully you're going to make those movies about the world and as you observe it. But still, so many filmmakers of my generation and eventually generations after me were really concerned with making movies that looked like movies, that felt like movies, and basically were nourished with their experience of movies. And that's something that always terrified me. It's to me, movies should not be about movies. They should be about your experience of life.
Yeah, and the same going for all other art forms in the sense that you're, and speaking of other art forms, during that time that you were so immersed in painting, you still had cinema somehow in the back of your mind.
It's very naive, So I can only, alas, speak of it in very childish terms. When I was growing up, I started painting as a teenager. I was like 15. I was 15 and I started, just playing with oil colors and canvases and whatever, and gradually I started working in different formats. And during the age of like 15 to 25, painting, drawing, graphism was really a central part of my life, and it was incredibly satisfying in the sense that. That there's this instant gratification of doing something. You have an emotion, you put it on a piece of paper, you put it on a canvas or whatever, and you work on it, and somehow here it is. I mean, you've done something, and you move on to something else. And so there was whereas of course it's not something I could have experienced in the field of cinema. When you're a teenager, you're certainly not going to. It's very difficult to get hold of the tools of cinema. It's very difficult to make anything that's like a movie. So the process of learning about movies is long, difficult, laborious. Whereas art is immediate. It has this. I think that for some reason, which is mysterious even to myself. I kind of had this need to practice an art, and I don't think, it was vital. It was like essential. It's when I grew up, I can't imagine to survive without having some place to express stuff that had to do with the abstract shapes and forms I was creating, but it was just incredibly necessary for me to feel that I could have my own creative world, which somehow was more important to me than whatever I was learning in school, because I just hated every minute of being in school. Something like that. So so I think I learned through painting what art was about for me, because of course when you are very young and you're there with your colors and your brushes and you're creating some abstract canvas, you get intuitively very fast to solving extremely complex questions, like what is it exactly you're doing, why you're doing it. Well, that's the difficult one. But but ultimately, when is it done? You know, when you're working on an abstract canvas, it's a very, at some point you have to decide, this is it. This is what I was, you know, you work on in different layers on top of layers. So and it evolves. I mean, something structures your canvas, you decide to get rid of it, and then all of a sudden something else seems to be emerging, and it might be the beginning of some thing that you did not have in mind, and that ultimately will become the paintings. But you know, the process can go on and on. At some point, you have to decide this is it. And why do you decide that? You know, it's a certitude. It's a certitude you have within yourself. So ultimately, that's exactly what art is about. Art is about being able intuitively to decide that some abstract thing, which you can't even begin to define, is exactly what you were looking for, and you can't put words on it. So you know, that kind of structured my relationship to art in general, and somehow in mysterious ways to cinema.
Just to think ahead a little bit, in terms of cinema, the films that you've made have been, let's say, you know, narrative films. They're films that tell stories with characters, and that your sense of what you're terming as abstraction now is something that is there within the reality of the world that you're creating. That it's a sense that's there, as opposed to making abstract cinema.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Well, yes, no, but I mean, you know, it's what I am saying about painting absolutely applies to narrative cinema.
Yeah.
You know, because I've never written screenplays that kind of used any of the basic rules of narration.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I've never really believed in stuff that you read in manuals or whatever. You know, what you teach, what you're taught in creative writing schools or whatever. You know, my writing, and you know, it's not a rule. It's the only way I know how to function. You know, it's just like it can be also seen as a handicap. But somehow, I need to write completely intuitively. It's you know, when you because usually when I start writing, I'm not sure where I'm heading. I'm not sure what the end of the story is going to be. Well, no. I mean, some writers do, but some don't. I mean, you know, it's certainly the process of writing is a process of invention of whatever you're trying to express, and most often it takes you to places you did not anticipate. It's so. Meaning that I would intuitively write this or that scene and not this or that other scene. You know, you constantly make choices that possibly you can't rationalize. So you know, what I am saying that include, you know, the relationship to this being carried by some subconscious notion of what you are looking for is something that will carry you even when you are telling a story which seems rational enough. You know, it's what somehow gives you the daring of structuring narratives that don't function like usual narratives do.
And during the time that you were, you know, when you were growing up, just to reiterate, you were energized by punk rock. You were energized by what you were reading. You said radicality.
Sure.
You know, specifically, we should point to Guy Debord.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. And then by genre movies, American genre movies, horror movies, to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yes, it's well, you know, just punk rock came up when I started, when I was a very young adult, and when I started doing things in life. You know, it's really like 1976. I'm 21.
Yeah.
I'm just finishing high school. You know, I've finished writing my master's degree, and I'm just ready to move on and do whatever I will do in life. At that point, I had realized that what I wanted to do in life was, I mean, I hoped I could be both a painter and a filmmaker, but at some point I realized that, you know, you have to choose which art you will focus on, because you can't really, I mean, you can't really have two careers. At least I could not. What was happening at that time? You know, where was the energy? What was changing the world? What was transforming the landscape I grew up in? Well, you know, it's the kind of energy the music had, which was part a nihilistic energy. You know, that stuff is not exactly an academic subject, so I'm not going to, you know, just get into big analysis of what punk rock is about. But you know, but still, it marks the end of a specific age. It marks the end of the political 1970s, meaning that the political 1970s were defined by the fact that people believed in a coming revolution.
Yes.
You know, that a revolution would come, which was really based on the initial impulse of May '68 in France and similar movements all over the world. And you know, there was this conviction that the purpose of this generation was to somehow make that revolution happen, and it was always about to come, and it ultimately never happened. But still, you had a lot of empty ideological talk. The rhetoric became more and more wooden, and more and more disconnected from real life. To me, the late 1970s or the mid 1970s were about the last. I mean, it's about the agony of that idea. It's the rhetorics were completely empty. It was lacking any relevance, and again, it was just everybody was living in some abstract world, completely cut off from reality, because they were we were. I mean, I was part of it in my own way. We were projecting whatever we were looking for in the future. So ultimately, it was like the last generation believing in the future. And when punk rock came up, it just broke the. I mean, it just broke the. Reference points of that culture. It had this radicality, which was about saying no future. No future is just like, you know, this kind of big punk rock stereotype. But it means something. It actually does mean something. It means that we don't believe in the fact that whatever we are about is going to be projected in the future. We are going to believe in the present, and we are just try to get hold of the present and eventually do something with the present, which was a way of going back to dealing with the world, with the present, and not just cutting yourself off from society and the tangible world ultimately. So, well, yes, you know, something that has to do with that kind of energy carried me when I started making, you know, my short films, or when I started writing about films, and because all of a sudden it just gave me a way of understanding what was going on in the present of my time. And so, you know, so that was, of course, that was important. And about Guy Debord, situationism. It's a slightly different story. To me it's also maybe a little more a story of the 70s in a sense that it's reading Debord or reading George Orwell or reading Simon Leys who wrote about what was happening in China at that time, kind of saved me from being swallowed up by the idiocy of of totalitarian leftism.
Yes. I think that this is a good time to go to the first clip, and I just want to say before we go to the first clip, this clip is projected from a DVD because there are very, very, very few prints of this film in the world right now, and everything else will be in 35. So let's go to that first clip.
Kansas, shuddering at last. Person operating in Kansas. Angry telephone calls to the university. Police dumbfounded, leaning on their radio carpet.
I just want to just briefly say that film is called Water. That's Olivier's fourth film, and it was made for the origin of the film was there was a series of films that were made by filmmakers about when they were 16. And you made your first film in 1986, so this film was 8 years later. And it's a film that should have been much more widely seen by now, but that's another topic. When you had the assignment, let's say, or when you knew that you had to do something autobiographical, where did you start? I mean, I just want to say that everyone who made these films had to have a party scene, and they were able to use, any of the music that was available to them from the day. And Olivier's party scene takes up basically almost the second half of the film, which is where the boy is on his way to. So I had a sense that you started with gestures that were connected with something you were just talking about, which is the sense of being young and just disconnected from what was right in front of you and projecting off into a future.
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, it's the film ended up being a major turning point for me because I've always made movies that in a way or another were connected to my experience. I mean, they are not exactly autobiographical, but they still certainly are nourished with my experience and sometimes even pretty closely. But I had never been literally autobiographical. I had this was the first time I had a commission to do something. Really, it's really something that it didn't even cross my mind before, and it's not something I had been looking for. But still, nothing of the sort had never come my way. So to me, it was an opportunity to experiment. It was an opportunity to because what it was about, and it's exactly what Ken said, except what they were asking for were 45-minute movies. I mean, it's like shorts. It was like a short story, and which meant that it was outside of any kind of commercial logic. It was not like mainstream TV. It was Arte, which is like a cultural channel. So basically, there was nothing to give too much weight to this project. It was extremely light. It was a film that there was space to experiment because, you know, worst comes to worst, it fails. I mean, it's a failed experiment, and that's it, you know. And only a few people are going to watch it on, you know, on a small TV channel, and that's it. Mm-hmm. So it was to me, it was an important moment because I had made 4 features, and I had a sense that I was starting not to repeat myself, but still, you know, I had developed a specific style in filmmaking. I was working always with the same crew, the same format, and you know, I was starting to feel uneasy with the framework I was functioning in, and I was not exactly sure which direction to go, what could just get me out of that cycle. And so, you know, it's to me, when I started working in imagining what Cold Water would be, I did not think this is the movie that's going to change my life, or this is not the movie that's going to change my filmmaking, but it was about, you know, let's see what I can do with that format. And because I did not imagine doing something, you know, that will still end up in TV, I said, okay, let's try and do something challenging. Just take the very little money I have to make a 45-minute film and see what happens if I turn it into a feature. Mm. You know, it's because they gave me the maximum I could have was like a 4-week shoot. Mm-hmm. 24 days, yeah. Meaning including the Saturdays, you know, it's like four weeks.
And it was the first time that you shot on Super 16?
It's the first time I was shooting in Super 16, which also I mean, you know, I had never worked in such a short time. So the idea is that I could do something that would be a semi-experimental film. Mm-hmm. In the way Philippe Garrel would be making his films in the 1960s, or some of the experimental filmmakers that I admired, it also. So I wrote a very simple canvas, which gradually expanded. It grew. And growing, it gave me space just to describe the mood of those times. Mm-hmm. And to me, the kind of fascinating aspect of it is that it reconnected me with the teenager I had been. Mm-hmm. I mean, what you have seen is, you know, it's fairly close to my experience of that age. You know, I had, you know, it's also, it doesn't involve too much narrative. There's no dialogue. You see my Hungarian nanny, you know, who was like the person I loved the most in the world. I mean, you know, she was my mother, grandmother, whatever, and everything at the same time. And she was very Catholic, and every evening she would read, like, you know, she would say a prayer in Hungarian, and she would be just and I would also be saying my prayer in Hungarian, and
you would speak Hungarian with her.
I spoke Hungarian with her, yeah. And I lived in a house that was in the countryside, and I have so many memories, you know, just of escaping from the house, just going through the roof and getting my bike, and, you know, and driving off through the woods to go wherever I would be going, and it had this kind of Tarkovsky feeling to it, right? And specifically the mirror.
Mirror. I was going to say. You read my mind. Yeah. I read yours.
And I don't know. I somehow maybe through writing about films, through making my own early films, I had lost touch with that kid. I had also because, again, you know, we were talking about the fact that when I started making films, they were defined as this kind of punk rock thing of energy, which was about leaving the past behind. And it had completely cut me off from whoever I had been in the 70s. And somehow the Cold Water was a movie where I could go back to whatever whatever nourished me as a teenager, and it reconnected me to somehow something essential within me that will ultimately be the creative core of my work to come. And also the fact that I was shooting in Super 16 with kids, which I did not have like famous actors to deal with. It was teenagers. The fact that because the camera is very light, we could shoot handheld, which I had not done that much before. I invented a new style. I gave myself a new freedom, and it opened the door to somehow bringing my work to some new places that were ultimately, much more, I don't know, which were more stimulating and connected with me in deeper ways. So it was a very important film.
At what point did you recognize that sense of reconnection? Was it during the shooting?
It was yes, absolutely. It was like, because when I was shooting this scene, you can't have, I don't know, it's one thing to write this is half a page in terms of a screen,
right.
in terms of screenplay. It's I just did not realize that when I would be shooting it, I would recapture something that was so deeply embedded inside of me. I had no idea. So I was a spectator of my own film. I was watching this kid be myself, and all of a sudden, just the whole thing would just come back to me so powerfully. And well, we're talking about this scene, but you imagine, when we were shooting the long party scene with all the kind of music I was listening to, and which was, what just defined, that age for me, and just being around the kids, going to the set to shoot that party scene every evening, and just find myself in the middle of the woods in that house, in that old ruins, in those ruins, with those kids smoking grass, half dancing, burning furniture in this like big fire. To me, it was just like revisiting those times. It was just living those times again. It was an extremely fascinating and disturbing experience. But it kind of made me realize the power of cinema in a way I only had an intuition of before. Here I had it in front of my own eyes. There was this extraordinary dialogue between my present and my past, and the line was blurred. And when we finished shooting the film, I had this incredibly melancholic feeling of having once again left my teenage years behind. That I had the privilege through one movie to relive those years briefly, in a glimpse, but still in a very relevant and powerful way. And I had no idea that just movies could go that far. They could be as disturbing as that.
When you were, just a moment ago, when you were talking about Super 16, you mentioned the lightness of the camera.
Yeah.
But I'm just remembering back to when a conversation that we had years ago, and something that you said about films in general. And I'm saying this actually to help set up the next clip, which is that films should be light. Meaning not that they should be, light like all romantic comedies, that they should be approached in a state of lightness so that you can be open to what happens in the moment, in the world around you, and not arrive at the set with storyboards.
I mean, to me, the major problem that you have to overcome when you're making films is the weight.
Yeah.
It's such a heavy art form. I mean, just it's it's not just anecdotic. You have all those trucks and all those people and this heavy machinery and stuff it takes 4 guys to carry, and that's the tools you're going to use to try to create something as fragile as the poetry into cinema. You just have to manage to get rid of that horrible weight. You have to carry. There is something so. You have to manage to get rid of the weight of the industry, because it's ultimately movies are easy to make. They are made up as being complicated, but they are ultimately they are simple and they can be done with light tools. And the problem is just to transcend all that weight and manage to make it light in terms of, but not just in terms of the images you create. It's also on the set. You must help everybody forget the weight. Your actors forget the weight. Your technicians forget the weight, and help them forget the rules, because it's movies. I mean, often it's you discuss your job with people who don't do movies, and they say, oh, this it's wow, just directing movies, that must be really complicated. Say, no, it's not complicated at all. Movies can happen on their own. You don't have to be there. I mean, everybody, it's the directing movies is just disrupting the process.
But there are a lot of films playing tonight. You could go see a couple.
Yeah, it's because basically on the set, everybody knows exactly what they have to do. Yes. They do that every single day of their lives. So so we'll do, and you get there and say, no, we're not going to do that way. We'll try something else. Maybe it doesn't work, but ultimately, just please, just okay. And so in a way or another. You have to go on the set and create chaos, some kind of chaos, and so that just people they lose their reference points, and they have to just use their brains and not not go through the motions. And ultimately, that's what movies are about. Because again, it's just like they don't need you to make the film. Just go on. Oh, here's the call sheet. I mean, you know what you have to do. I'll be home, and just call me when you're done.
But they need you to make your film.
They need you to create confusion.
Right. Which is a good place. It's a good place to set up the next clip. So if we could go to that, please.
France giving money to France for make a film nobody sees, only for the intellectuals. It's, I don't know. But now it's over. It's finished. I hope.
If there's just one type of film at the theaters, you'd be so sick of that too, and you'd be complaining.
You don't think the intellectual film killed the industry of the cinema?
That's dialogue taken from real life, but we won't say from where. Right? I mean, over the years, I've heard so many people say things, very similar to that. In France, in the United States, this kind of blind hatred and resentment of, cinema that's not a choreography of violence, I guess, right? And that's not instantly aimed at opening in 1,000 theaters and recouping its investment. And this film, Irmavap, was made, you had been concentrating on trying to get a much bigger, more, a much more complex production off the ground. Actually, 2, if I remember correctly, because
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
actually.
yeah, and you wrote. I remember you saying, "Well, I wrote it very fast, and I'm going to shoot it very fast, and that's the way that it should be. It should be, yeah."
Well, yes, the thing is that when I made Cold Water
Yeah.
in 4 weeks, and it was not an experimental film. It did actually have a career. It opened. People seemed to like it, and it had an international career actually, in film festivals mostly. It kind of comforted me in the notion that if I can get away with that, it means that it gives me the freedom of movement without cinema. I'm not dependent on getting money here or getting money there, because shooting 4 weeks with no stars and with a small crew, you always manage. I benefited obviously from that when I made Irmavap, because again, Irmavap was a similar canvas. I mean, I genuinely wrote this film in 9 days. Yeah. And we shot it in 4 weeks again. And it was the only way we could have done it, because when we gave the screenplay to this weird movie about filmmaking involving a Hong Kong movie star and Jean-Pierre Léaud, I mean, they laughed in our face. I mean, we managed to get a tiny bit of money from Canal Plus, and we made the film with that, and that's it. Nothing, well, yes. I mean, at that time, I was preparing a much bigger production, but it had been postponed twice, and which was Les Destinées Sentimentales, a period piece. Turned out, I made it a few years later in the end. Plus, I had also another project which was not happening, and so one part of it was just the frustration with the process of film production in France, which was getting I thought was just like tedious, and the desire to make something that was a little bit like the movies like Jean-Luc Godard, the movies Jean-Luc Godard was making in the 60s, which were like pamphlets, like just movies that kind of captured the moment and just threw it on screen.
The newspaper.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
And the way a newspaper does, and and I felt this. Irmavap is about many things, but and it was an incredibly liberating movie also for me. I mean, it kind of took me really one step further in terms of what I felt I could, where the areas where I felt I could go in terms of my filmmaking. But this specific scene, it also has to do with what Irmavap is about. I mean, I just wanted at some point just to expose the obscenity of that anti-intellectualism that I felt rising within the French film culture. It was just so, I don't want to elaborate about it because it's I think it's somehow serious issues, but at that time the one way I felt I could deal with them was within the genre of comedy. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be just to patronize them, or to be too I didn't want to whine about it or to theorize, and I thought it was just satisfying just to make fun of it. Mm-hmm. But still it was a serious issue, because ultimately it this kind of separation between art films and filmmakers who wanted to make just to benefit from the power of the industry, basically. It's something that ended up never really healing
Yeah.
It's you really have a very deep separation within French cinema that remains to these days. But it's more or less when this happened, and it happened in terms kind of similar to what my friend Antoine Basseler, who plays the cretin or the moron, etc., was more or less explaining.
Yeah. I think that we'll move on to the next clip, and just in setting it up, say that right from the beginning, the first film of yours that I ever saw, I was shocked by the sense of speed. And when I partly mean the speed of the camera, it's partly the speed of thought of the characters, the way that they react to one another and the way that they move through life. And it's something that to me, that immediately struck me as of the world that I knew, in terms of not going to the movies, but the world that as I experienced it. It's something that I think has been, it's almost unique to your films, but maybe there's if there's a way to talk about that a little bit in terms of it, because it's connected with this sense of lightness, the lightness of filmmaking in a way too, of you as a filmmaker reacting to the immediate circumstances of the production and the actors and the mood and what's happening, but it's also very much a subject in a way.
Well, yes, in the sense that I believe in trying not to be boring, in a way. So I kind of even when I'm writing, when I'm editing, when I'm it's kind of a concern.
Yes.
And and also I believe in concision. Yeah. Which is and I think I function adding layer upon layer of concision.
Yes.
It's something that I learned from, and ultimately it's something I got from my admiration for Bresson.
Yeah.
I would say
For Robert Bresson.
For Robert Bresson, because again, I mean, you have a lot of genre movies that have that kind of speed, but in terms of where I got it from and how the way I use it within my film, it's the sharpness of the editing of the films of Bresson that kind of taught it to me. Yeah. And then I expanded on that, but it's absolutely where it comes from. And also I suppose that the style of Robert Bresson comes from the French 18th century prose. Which again has this kind of concision. It's this trying to be say as much as you can in the fewest possible words. Yeah. So then again, I mean, it becomes in a way or another my style, and it's the way I tell my stories. Because also I suppose that it's also what the reason why I like the pop song format, which is just the concision of it, and it's something. So the way I film has to do with the energy of the music, and with again the concision of Bresson. I think it's the two elements at the root of whatever I have done in terms of. I mean, it's how I've defined my style. And again, it's another thing that has to be said. In terms of what is the style of a filmmaker, it's something that you develop over the years in collaboration with your cameraman, your editor. It's what I call my style is basically something that through the years I have invented with my cameraman Denis Lenoir, my other cameraman Eric Gauthier, and my editor Luc Barnier. I mean, it's what basically my style. Is what happens when we work together.
Yes. So let's go to the next clip, please. That, of course, is a clip from Demon Lover, which many of you probably saw here the other night. And to return to this idea of concision, in the case of this scene, it's a concision that's poetic concision that keeps veering into almost purely poetic concision, and then moves along with to tell a story at the same time. The other night in Brooklyn, when we were talking after the screening of this film, you began by being a little bit uncomfortable because this film has been, you said it's like, I was afraid that it would blow up in my face when I made it, and you've witnessed some extreme reactions to it. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the feelings that you were dealing with about the modern world when you were making this film.
Well,
or conceiving.
I can do that, and I can't.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that Demon Lover is a movie both about ideas and a completely poetic film. It's both dealing with abstract ideas, but it's also a movie about sensations, about feelings, and I think that when I was making the film, simultaneously, yes, there was something about the corporate world, about the way there was the modern world was just losing touch with reality on so many levels. I mean, meaning in terms of the brutal mechanics of the economy, and simultaneously the alienation of our relationship with images. And it all made for something I thought was deeply disturbing, but which I could not exactly dissociate myself from, in the sense that I felt as guilty as anyone from my fascination with also the surface of that world. So I tried simultaneously to depict it, not to shy away from the most violent and most disturbing aspect of it, and simultaneously to let myself be carried away by the poetic logic, the subconscious logic of the film. It's really it's a film that I made. I shot it in 2001. I wrote it in 2000. I had just made the movie I was telling you about just earlier, Les Destinées Sentimentales, which was, to me, was kind of an achievement. It was this huge film that I had carried on my back for so long. I had finally made it. It took like ages to make. It was just so difficult to make at every single stage. I got out of it absolutely drained, and then still, because it was a period piece, I had this, and it dealt with characters, emotions, and so on and so forth. I felt it kind of closed the chapter in terms of my work, and that after that film I could start again, and I could start again with and try, because it was the beginning of the 21st century, something like that, just what happens if I try and make movies in a completely different way? What happens if I try to use a completely different style, a completely different narrative, completely different characters, and deal with things that French cinema has never really dealt with? What happens if? But I knew that if I could only do it if I gave myself the irresponsible freedom of trying to go all the way. And I think that if I had been trying to verbalize what I was doing, if I tried to rationalize what was going on while I was making this film, I would never have made it. I kind of jumped into this film, and no, you know, and I had no idea how I was going to shoot most of the stuff in that film. I mean, I had never really even remotely done things in that direction. And so, you know, it just put me in a completely new place in terms of filmmaking. The movie was written, again, as pretty experimental. And I imagined that I would make this movie about the corporate world with the budget of a tiny independent film. I thought this was, again, going to be some kind of Irmavap territory. Except that for some reason, I don't know, I mean, so many, you know, I don't it was financed as, not as an expensive film, but it was financed as some average movie in the French film industry. You know, of course, this was much, I mean, on the paper, much more expensive to do than a regular film, but still, it was more money than I usually had while I was making my recent films. So I knew that I could also experiment in terms of texture, in terms of modern visuals. It was inspired by whatever was happening in visual arts. It was inspired, you know, it was inspired by, you know, it's the way the images of those years were something, there was a renewal in terms of the visual world I felt I was living in, and which had to do with the proliferation of layers of images. Movies had different style, had a different style. It had to do with the special effects a lot, but still, yeah, it was also in terms of what people wanted to see, the internet, the ads, the comics, whatever, you know. So to me, it was I was interested by the way, in a way of trying to absorb the crazy things that the subconscious of those times was creating, and again, not be scared by what they are, because up to that point, all the movies I had done were focused on reality. They were focused on real life characters, on the real life emotions of real life individuals, and everything that had to do with the uglier part of the contemporary world was something I would discard. I just did not want it to my film. I was like sanitizing in a way, you know, just the space of my films. And Demon Lover was pretty much about what happens if I try to deal with that stuff, not reject it, not discard it, but try to absorb it and do something with it and comment on it in a way. So, you know, it was, again, I let myself be carried by whatever was going on, and was not trying to intellectualize it.
And at the very end of shooting the film, 9/11 happened.
Well, yeah, we you know, it's like we were. It was like this. I mean, the last few days of shooting Demon Lover were like, you know, the craziest situation I ever found myself in. It was like, I don't know, it was the closest to making a movie on drugs I ever came close to. You know, it's just like we were in the desert in Mexico, in Chihuahua, you know, and all of a sudden just 9/11 happens, and we are in this ranch. It's a free. I mean, every morning we would drive like 3 hours to go to that ranch in the middle of the desert, and that's where we were shooting. You know, just helicopters flying up and down, and car chases and whatnot. You know, and which to me it was a completely abstract world. I mean, you know, I have never done that kind of movies, and plus it was done in this kind of end of the world atmosphere. You know, it was crazy. It was really, I don't know, you know, and I suppose that at least, you know, something of the madness of those few days kind of makes its way into the film.
Before we go into the next clip, I just want to say one of the subjects that was brought up the other night when we were in Brooklyn was, to address this. Every filmmaker gets a kind of a narrative imposed on them. And one that I think Olivier has had imposed on them is that he makes films in two registers, one with characters who, people sitting and talking to each other in restaurants or something, and then another of films like Demon Lover or Boarding Gate. And that narrative is obviously, just a convenience and for, lazy journalists, I guess. And it doesn't, when you just look at it even a little bit closely, it falls apart. But you were talking about the fact that making one film and staying within the world of one film drives you often to move in a different direction.
Well, yes, because you make a film, you put everything you have in the film.
Yeah.
My movies are, all of them, as good as whatever I was at the moment of making them.
Yeah.
It's just, there's not one movie that I made where I did not have the sense of absolutely throwing everything into the film. It's just like I've always made my movies as if they were simultaneously the first and last movie I will ever make. So it kind of when you finish making the film, you don't want to go back into the same territory because you're spent. You just don't. I mean, when I make a movie like Summer Hours, which deals with the loss of my mother, with very intimate emotions, I'm not going to do the same movie over again after that. I mean, I just don't want to touch it. And I'm perfectly unable. I mean, to find something that is as essential as emotional to me. So obviously I have to move on to some other place, and I think that it's to me, because I believe in the dialectics of reality. I really do believe that you in art you can move from the intimate to the universal. You can make movies that deal with what is going on within yourself, because that is something you can share with everybody, because it's part of the commonly shared human experience, and simultaneously you can make movies that are open to what happens in the big world around you, and that deal with the times, with the history, with the geopolitics of your time. I mean, it's to me there is no contradiction. To me it's I think that one register makes sense in connection with the other one.
Yes.
I think the intimate films make sense because they are connected to movies that deal with the broader picture. And the movies that deal with the broader picture are legitimized by the fact that they are connected with movies that deal with the essence of human experience. It's to me it's and also, you have filmmakers who, for some reason, define a world for themselves. They have space, characters, style, genre, eventually, and ultimately they will make that kind of film forever, and some of them are masterpieces. So I'm talking about great filmmakers, Romer for instance, and they somehow managed to put the whole world within. And Romer had 2 or 3 different styles of films.
Yes,
he was, they were the historical movies. Yes. They were so there's major, but still, he's the better example. Where they managed to put the whole world within this microcosmos, whereas you have other movies, and I of course relate to that myself, where cinema is a way of exploring the world. To me, what has always been fascinating with cinema is the possibility it has given me to visit the world in ways I would never have visited it otherwise. It gave me access to places, people, that just expanded my experience of what the world is about. I mean, I don't want to go into the bigger examples. There's a lot of bigger examples. Let's go straight to the tiniest example. You are in Paris. You've written a story, and it happens in apartments.
Yeah.
You look. You know. I've never made. I mean, okay. I made one film where we built an apartment. You know, but it's usually you just look for a place where you're going to shoot, and hopefully that has the most elements in common to what you have written, because often you don't really have the budget to really restructure it or refurnish it or whatever, or at least so you end up spending days visiting flats where real life people do live, and you know it's and they are not movie sets, they are actually real people, and you get into their places. It's pretty intimate, and you just look at how people live, and when it's part of your everyday experience as a filmmaker, meaning you would do that many times through the years, and spend days and days and days doing that, in various layers of society, in various areas of the town you live in the suburbs, whatever. You know, it just gives you. It gives you a fascinating notion of reality, of the reality of how people live, and you learn things. So you know, this is the tiniest example, but you can expand it as far as you can. I mean, you know, I've made movies in Tokyo, I've been making movies in Hong Kong, I've been moving, you know, and I've been exploring those areas, I've been discovering those areas thanks to the specifics of what movie making is about, and it's fascinating. It's you know, it just it's something that opens your eyes and stimulates you and makes you understand better the world you live in. So yes, I mean, to me, movies have to be a way of exploring the world, exploring the present, exploring the past. Or in the case of Demon Lover, you know, exploring some kind of near future, I suppose.
Let's go to the next clip, and this clip is just a little bit lengthier. I think it has to be for very particular reasons.
On a déjà un peu cherché, il y a vraiment des choses bien. Et c'est vrai que par rapport à la France, les prix sont dérisoires. Tu viendrais nous voir, j'espère.
Bah oui, bien sûr.
Ah oui, bien sûr. Ah, parce que... Enfin, nous, on n'aura pas l'occasion de venir en Europe.
Pas du moins pendant les quelques années à venir.
Après, on verra.
That's, of course, a scene from Summer Hours. And last night, we went to see a film by a filmmaker that we both admire, David Fincher, The Social Network. And after it was over, you were, you know, remarking on the character of Mark Zuckerberg in the film and how really modern he is as a character, how he's someone who could only come from now. And I must say that I had the same feeling when I saw this film, and particularly acutely watching this scene. And the reason I had that feeling watching this scene was because I just was so moved by watching people who didn't want to say something and to say it at the same time. There's something that to me seems intimately connected to, you know, the life around me, that's for sure. Who want things to be to move on smoothly and to have decisions made for them. And when the decision is finally made, they say, "Oh yeah, sure, no, that's what I said." I find this. I was really moved with the simplicity of the scene, but also with the body language of people moving away towards each other as they arrive at this incredibly momentous decision. And it's a film that, you know, came from a very, as always, as you just said, from a very personal impulse on your part,
Yeah.
right?
Well, yes, sure. It's watching this clip. I mean, it's okay. You know, what it is about is pretty obvious. So I don't think it hardly needs any explanation, but it's but I just remember shooting it, and that kitchen was a corridor that was just like, you know, this wide, and you know, so, and it was just so absurdly small, and right before that there is another scene in the living room. And I had written this long scene in the living. I mean, basically, there was a scene in the living room, and then the food came, and they sat at the table and started having dinner, having that discussion. And during the process of preparing the film, I got just completely bored with the notion of sitting the characters around the table. Yeah. I just, you know, I just could not picture it. I had no idea how to do it. It felt wrong, and then we found, you know, when we found the flat where we ended up shooting the scene, I said, you know, just, you know what, let's shoot the scene in the kitchen. And let's shoot the scene in the kitchen and use the balcony, you know, because there's this small balcony. And then came the day of actually shooting. You know, we shot. You know, I had like in our schedule like 2 days. Mm-hmm. Was it 1 day or 2 days? It must have been 2 days. In you know, for that scene in the kitchen and the balcony, and I never plan ahead how I'm going to shoot. I do it in the morning before going on set. Mm-hmm. And you know, usually you know, sometimes it's difficult, but it takes time. I kind of figure it out, and you know, and end up having a structure for the scene, which I am going to follow or not. But I know I have some kind of safety net to fall back into. You know, so I have it written down, and I go on the set, and then I adapt my shots and turn it into whatever will be in the film. So in this case, but usually it's sometimes difficult, but I manage, you know, I kind of handle it. The morning of shooting that scene, you know, I woke up and I had the plan, and you know, I said, just what got into me of deciding to shoot this absurdly long scene in this absurdly small space, where basically you only have 2 angles. You have your angle 1, angle 2. You know, it's when we walked into the kitchen. You know, I was with a cameraman, Eric Gauthier. So please, Eric, let me introduce you angle 1 and introduce you angle 2. You know, and I you know, I just could not figure out how to do it, and so I ended up like really like improvising it on the set. I shot it in so many different because it was all ultimately whatever the scene was about would be defined by the way the characters would be moving closer, further, regrouping. I mean, it was this choreography within this absurdly small space, but I had to invent it. Yeah. On the spot, because it was just I had no idea how to design it prior. So it's something I very rarely do ultimately, but it's here it you know, and it involved shooting many different versions with many different movements, and we kind of patched it together with Luc, with Luc Barnier, my editor. But we had like a mountain of material. Mm-hmm. Because it was so it must be like the one most complicated scene. I mean, it's very simple in terms of, you know, what goes on, but in terms of how we shot it, it was like a nightmare, an absolute nightmare.
Well, it paid off.
Yes, it did. And of course it involves a lot of improvisation. Mm-hmm. More than in other scenes in the same film. I mean, it's a film where I used a lot of improvisation, but here I kind of recognized lines. I mean, there's many lines here and there, which was basically what the actors tried at a specific moment, or that I because
you invented on the spot.
I invented on the spot. Yeah. I invented on the spot. Also to make, you know, also to kind of patch up what you know, what we were. I mean, just to, because all the movements I had kind of to invent them. So it was kind of taking shape in front of me. So in terms of what I was seeing, it would inspire new ideas, and I would add a line here, add a line there, and ultimately the scene grew into something that's ultimately fairly different to what was on the paper. It expanded.
I think we'll go right into the last clip, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And why don't we just move right into the last clip?
But I would rather die for our cause. Sacrifice everything. You know that. For me, there's no going back.
You have to guess which film that was a clip from. Hands up. Carlos was difficult to choose a clip from because it's an incredibly complex film. And actually, I think that this scene gives a sense of why it's so complex, because it's dealing with geopolitics on a scale that is, it's almost unheard of in cinema, I think.
This was sorry to go back to the technicalities, but this was incredibly complicated scene to shoot. It was incredibly complicated scene to shoot. It was mostly because the actor who plays Wadi Haddad speaks really, really bad English. I mean, he never acted in English before. And basically he could not say the lines. So we did something like 20 takes for it, and this is a patch up of tiny bits and pieces just to and in the end it made sense, and in the end I think he's great in the film, but it was just like a really difficult, and at some point after 20, we were like into the 20, he fainted at some point, he just so I just freaked out, of course, it's one of the longest dialogue scenes in the film, right? Extremely complicated because involving two different spaces with, I don't know. I mean, it was difficult to shoot. It was difficult to shoot, and it's in terms of the writing, it's really the articulation between the first part of the film and the second part of the film, meaning that it deals with the consequences of what has happened during the first part of the film and propels us into the new operation that Wadi Haddad is assigning to Carlos. But it also has to deal with the complexity of the relationship between the two men. Yeah. And it has also to deal with explaining the politics of the operation they are planning, which is you have to get your audience at least to understand the basics.
Yes.
So you hope they will get like 30% of it or something, you're lucky if they get it. Because it's I know myself as an audience, when I watch that kind of scene, basically I get 30% of what's going on, so I don't, I imagine that the rest of the audience is like me. And so you really have to hammer in that this is, that this has two layers. One layer is what is going to be fed to the media, which is built in the operation, right? We're going to pretend this is a Palestinian operation, like just broadly, yeah. But then the reality is that the operation is a commission from the Iraqis who want to get rid of someone who doesn't want to increase the price of oil when they do need the money for their own ends. Specifically smashing the Kurdish independence movement, like he says. So this is going to be the framework of the next hour and a half of film. This is what they will be doing. So you need at the same time to give so much information, to deal with such complex interaction between those two characters, and in spaces that are often, again, it's long scene in a small room. Yeah, well, the second room is pretty small. With an actor who was very difficult to push. And with losing the light, at the end of the day, I mean, just like the basic problems of filming, it was an extremely difficult scene to conceive, to shoot, and once we had it, finished, I was just like relieved because I had a sense that somehow one of the key moments of the film kind of worked.
Mm-hmm. We're going to open it up for a few questions from the audience, so if anyone wants to.
You talked about the heavy load of making films with the equipment and all of that. This brings up the notion with lightweight equipment. Many European directors are now shifting to smaller camcorders and all of this. Would this interest you in shooting this way now and with the freedom it offers?
Yes and no, because ultimately, for me, the problem of the weight of the camera has been really solved since the days when I was making my early films. I mean, because the Super 16 camera is pretty light, and now you have really light 35mm equipment, which is fairly similar to what to the kind of equipment you would use when you're shooting, HD certainly, but but also if you're shooting DV cam or whatever. It's you can make home movies with your small camera. I mean, you have actual cameras which have a very good texture and are extremely light, and you can eventually even put them in your pocket. So yes, sure. I mean, that's but the logistics of narrative filmmaking involve sets, lights, costumes, actors, so on and so forth. I love that texture. I'm not a documentary filmmaker. I'm not a diarist. I love the fiction. I love the space it gives you to invent, to recreate a world. So in many ways, the light. I've been gradually making my films with less light, because also now we have the film stocks are so much more sensitive, so you need much less light, and I've been trying to have small crews and so on and so forth. But to me, it's not making a tiny sketch of a film with a small camera is interesting. I mean, I've done that. I've done documentaries using small cameras, but ultimately, it's not what I am looking for. I don't think so.
Hi, thanks to you both. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your practice as a writer, and I was wondering if you noted, you mentioned an agony of rhetoric earlier in your talk, if you noted an agony of rhetoric at Cahiers du Cinéma when you approached the publication, and if so, how that impacted you as a writer on the one hand. And also, I'm kind of curious about what led you to leave that practice behind.
Well, it's ultimately it's a complex question because it has it deals with many issues. I mean, let's say that one of the elements has to do with how writing led me to making movies in a certain way. Again, because I started painting and having a visual relationship to cinema, or a poetic and visual relationship to cinema, writing was not so much part of my world. And it's only gradually that I understand that if I wanted to make movies the way I wanted to make movies, I had, in a way or another, to learn how to write. And ultimately, what would lead me to filmmaking was not images, it was words, and it was the capacity of articulating words. So I consciously learned how to write. First, how to write screenplays, clumsy screenplays for short films. And then I met Serge Danet and Serge Toubiana, who were the chief editors of Cahiers du Cinéma in those years. And they asked me, oh, you're a young filmmaker, and we want to open up the magazine to new writers because times are changing or whatever. Would you be interested in writing? And it had not exactly crossed my mind that I could write film criticism, film theory, film journalism, or whatever it would involve in being an editor of that magazine. But I was kind of willing to have a shot at it for a few reasons. One reason was that I did not feel I was mature enough to make a feature. That somehow essential aspects of filmmaking, of the approach of filmmaking, somehow escaped me. And also, for the very also simple fact that I did not want to be a film critic, I did not want to be a film writer, but Cahiers du Cinéma is a magazine that had been historically written by would-be filmmakers, so somehow it could be part of the the path to become a filmmaker. So I had a shot at it, and I wrote 2 very clumsy, small pieces about minor films, and for some reason they kind of liked it, or at least they were generous enough to trust me that I could do better than that one day, and they published them. For me, writing for Cahiers du Cinéma was like film school. I did not go to film school. I studied French literature, and writing for that magazine was a way for me to try and answer the questions I had about what movie making was about, and it was an opportunity also to meet filmmakers I admired, ask them questions about how they worked, and also to travel, to go to film festivals, to go to Asia and watch movies that I would never have seen otherwise, and become in that in the process infinitely more aware of the filmmaking of my time. It's I had an education not only in what the French cinema of that time was about, or the American films that you get also in France, but I had an education in what world cinema was about, and specifically emerging, the cinema in emerging countries, or the emerging cinema in Asian countries more specifically. And
I just want to say very specifically Taiwan,
because
you were one
Taiwan,
of the first people to write about Ho Xiaoshen and Edward Yang.
Yes,
yeah.
And meeting them was a very important element for me, right before I started making my own films. So that's one part of it, and the other part being that from the minute I had a sense that my films could happen, I cut off from film school. To me, writing about movies was a way of thinking about the films I would be making in the future. So from the moment I was on a set and I had to solve every 100 times a day ethical or technical or theoretical problems, of course the action was much more exciting to me than than studying about it. So it was a completely natural shift. I came back to writing later, and I still do write once in a while because I just enjoy it. But from the minute I started making film, I just cut off with it, and it took me like really a few years before I got back into it.
I have 2 questions. And the first has to do more with your research into a subject or an idea as an artist, and the way that you then work with your actors to sort of bring them into understanding who they are as characters within that process. And then the second one, the second question has to do with Carlos specifically, and I'm glad that you showed that scene, because I think it was that scene specifically at which I moved from the sort of intimate into the universal in looking at Carlos more as a portrait of America in a way. And I read recently that the actual Carlos had mentioned that he believed that the one mistake in the history of it is that it was not Saddam Hussein who had actually funded, but it was actually Gaddafi who had funded that. And I wondered in a way if that was a gesture on your part to sort of open up the conversation to being more contemporary.
Many questions. It's in terms of who commissioned the OPEC operation. It's a complicated subject that really does not have an easy answer. For some reason, Carlos is obsessed with putting it on the back of Gaddafi. It's not exactly clear why, because he's never really given any keys to any of his operation. But in that case, he rabidly sustains that it's absolutely Gaddafi and him only who commissioned that operation. It's I base myself on all the on research which comes from obviously a lot of the Carlos biographies, but also from first-hand research in like the intelligence community and so on and so forth. And basically Carlos is the only person who pretends that Gaddafi is involved. Gaddafi might have been involved in a minor way, but it's totally an Iraqi operation. I mean, at least that's the common view at this stage. So I'm not a historian, I'm not a journalist, but it kind of gives you an insight into the complexities of getting a lot of the elements in this story right, because it's like the world of intelligence. It's full of mirages and false hypotheses. So in that case, again, in terms of Carlos saying that this is Gaddafi, the question is, why is he saying that? And as long as I don't have a clear answer, I can't take him seriously on it. In terms of how how I work with actors, it's a long and complex issue, and I mean, like the simplest way to answer honestly to that question is that I consider that, to me, it's about choosing an individual to play a specific part. Once I have chosen that individual to play that specific part, and not based on the fact that he looks like the part, but based on the fact that he does not look like the part, that he brings to the part something else than the writing, something that I had not anticipated, which will force me to go like one step further than what I had in the back of my mind. I don't want someone just basically to verify whatever I've written in the screenplay. I want someone to take it further on the basis that he has in him something similar to the character and simultaneously something different, substantially different. But once I have chosen that actor, I give him the part. I consider that he knows more than me about the part. He knows more than me about, because we have in common whatever is written in the screenplay. Then the interior logic of the character, what drives him, what is ultimately what will be driving that specific actor. Whatever truth he will find in himself that connects him with the truth of that specific character. And Edgar Ramirez is like a perfect example. Edgar Ramirez, he has much more insights than me into who Carlos is, because he's from Venezuela, because he grew up in the same region, because because he's a Hispanic speaker, because he speaks all the same languages as Carlos. So there were so many moments, so many scenes in the film where I just listened to what Edgar had to say in terms of approaching the scene, because to me he was Carlos. To me it's always kind of awkward ultimately when I discuss like the real Carlos or something, because to me the real Carlos is extremely remote. I mean, he's something I based this story on when I was writing and so on and so on. But since then, when I hear the word Carlos, I see Edgar ultimately. It's a kind of so it's kind of disturbing. But to me, I was going on the set every single day to film Carlos, and that was him.
Okay, so I guess it's quite obvious that American cinema tends to be more commercial, and then still it seems that French cinema is more intellectual, as it seems you're talking about. How does that affect the way you seek producers or seek money for funding your films?
Well, the issue is freedom, really. It's not to me. When I make movies, it's again, it's based on my writing, on what inspires me at a specific moment, but in the hope that there will be a broad audience, right, to see it. I mean, you whatever artwork you make, even the most experimental or the weirdest, you always have in the back of your mind the hope that there will be an audience who will be interested, who will follow you on that path. I mean, they never. But then it's the issue is, of course, is just not to compromise your vision. It's the thing is that to be true to the way you see things, to the movies you want to make, to a specific way of making cinema, and in the trust that the audience will respect that and somehow will connect with what you are doing. It's not the other way around, meaning you don't make movies to adapt to what the audience is asking. So in that sense, I understand your question, because yes, of course, when you try to get your films financed, what the system expects from you is movies that will adapt to whatever the audience is expecting. But that was yesterday. The problem is when you're making movies and when you're making art movies, which can also be considered in a way or another as experimenting, you're trying to figure out what the audience will want tomorrow. What the cinema, the coming cinema, can be about. And and in that sense, you have certain responsibility, because you in terms of when you make independent films, it's really important just to try as much as you can to put to the best possible use the freedom you have. And to make it to make it to the best possible use involves trying things that have not been tried, and eventually open up doors for other filmmakers in the future. There has to be some risk involved, and in terms of the way you make films, again, it's all about. It's not about format. It's about freedom. I mean, in my experience, been lucky enough to be able to make movies that were tiny budgets, bigger budgets, but every single time I managed to create a situation of complete freedom, but it involves being creative in terms of production. I think that you have to imagine your films and also imagine, I mean, it's something you can do in Europe in a way or another, and simultaneously imagine the production framework where you will be making your film. Meaning that if you stay, under a certain level of budget, you have complete freedom. If you go beyond that budget, you will have more control. You will have more, you will have more people on your back, and eventually you will lose some of your freedom. So it's movies is it's a weird equation between the movie you want to do, the conditions you're ready to, I mean the risks you're taking, and ultimately the how you manage to make the movie you want to make while protecting your complete freedom.
The hour is late and there's a lot more to say, but I think we need to call it a night. So thank you all for coming, and thanks.